Most species facing a universe that is vast, cold, and entirely indifferent to suffering learn the art of hiding. Humanity conversely learned to hit back. When the Vord Armada glassed a destitute mining outpost on the Orion Spur, they anticipated a tepid diplomatic protest or cowering fear. They failed to account for the fact that human bureaucracy moves at the speed of light when sufficiently provoked, and human vengeance moves even faster. The Vord required 20 years to orchestrate their invasion. It took humanity exactly 4 minutes to dismantle it. Jericho 7 wasn't a military stronghold. It was a glorified gas station clinging to the side of a dead, nameless moon in the deep black. Major Thomas Cooper stared at the primary observation window, a mug of synthetic coffee cooling in his hand. The coffee tasted like battery acid and burnt plastic. He drank it anyway. It was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality on a Friday morning that felt exactly like the Tuesday before it and the Sunday before that. Jericho 7 was a titanium blister on a rock that smelled permanently of ozone and recycled sweat. Its sole purpose was to extract helium-3 from the lunar dust, refine it, and shoot it back to the inner colonies via automated freighters. There were exactly 42 human beings on this rock. Most of them were engineers with bad attitudes and gambling debts. A dozen were security personnel who hadn't fired a weapon at anything other than a stationary paper target in 5 years. And then there was Cooper, 50 years old, a hairline in full retreat, and counting the days until his pension kicked in. He took another sip of the terrible coffee. "Jenkins, give me a diagnostic on the external scrubbers. Sector 4 is blowing dust into the mess hall again." Sarah Jenkins didn't look up from her console. She was 22, fresh out of the Naval Academy, and marooned on Jericho 7 because she had the supreme misfortune of possessing actual talent in a military branch that preferred blind obedience. "Scrubbers are functioning within acceptable parameters, Major. The seal on the airlock is just shot. I put in a requisition for a new gasket 3 months ago." "Put in another one," Cooper grunted, setting his mug down. "And use capital letters this time. Maybe command will think we're yelling." David Hobbs, the station's tactical officer, a title that was functionally useless on a mining rig, snorted from across the command deck. Hobbs was pushing 40, missing the pinky finger on his left hand from an old loader accident, and survived out here by maintaining a steady, functional buzz on smuggled gin. "They don't care, boss. We're a tax write-off. As long as the helium keeps flowing, they wouldn't care if we were breathing vacuum." Cooper opened his mouth to reply. He never got the chance. The command deck didn't just light up, it screamed. A high-pitched, bone-rattling klaxon shattered the monotonous hum of the life support systems. The overhead lighting snapped from harsh white to a violent, pulsing amber. Cooper's coffee mug rattled off the console, shattering against the grated deck plate. "Jenkins." Cooper barked, the lazy cynicism evaporating from his voice in a fraction of a second. The old instincts buried under years of administrative boredom violently clawed their way to the surface. "Talk to me. Proximity alert," Jenkins stammered. Her hands flew across the holographic interface, her eyes widening as the data flooded her screen. "Massive spatial distortion, just outside the gravity well." "A freighter?" Hobbs asked, already moving to his station. He wasn't drunk anymore. "No," Jenkins said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "No, the mass profile is wrong. It's too big. It's way too big." Cooper stepped up behind her, staring at the tactical plot. The deep black emptiness of the display was suddenly violently polluted by red contacts. 1, then 5, then 20. They kept multiplying, blooming on the screen like a digital infection. Space tore open. Through the reinforced glass of the observation window, Cooper saw it. The stars didn't just streak, they bent and snapped. The void belched forth a fleet of ships that defied human engineering. They were jagged, asymmetric monstrosities built of dark, light-absorbing metal that looked more grown than manufactured. They possessed no running lights, no visible thrusters. They looked like jagged splinters of obsidian thrust into the soft belly of the cosmos. "Identify," Cooper ordered. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. "No transponder signals," Jenkins said, her fingers shaking. "Energy signatures are off the charts. Major, they're charging weapons." "Shields up," Cooper roared. "Hobbs, spin up the point defense batteries. Send a wideband distress." The first strike didn't make a sound. There was no cinematic explosion, no roar of laser fire. There was just a blinding actinic flash of violet light, and then the station's southern hemisphere simply ceased to exist. The impact threw Cooper across the deck. He hit the bulkhead hard, the breath driven from his lungs in a sharp gasp. The artificial gravity stuttered, dropped them an inch, and caught them again with a sickening lurch. The air instantly grew cold. The smell of ozone was immediately overpowered by the stench of burning insulation, melting copper, and the sharp metallic tang of vaporized blood. Jericho 7 shuddered, groaning like a dying animal, as massive bulkheads automatically slammed shut, desperately, trying to seal off the vented sections. Hobbs pulled himself up by his console, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead. "Point defense is gone," he yelled over the deafening roar of the depressurization klaxons. "Habitation blocks A through D are... They're gone, Major. Atmosphere is venting. Shields are holding at 20%, but the grid is collapsing. 30 people, gone in the span of a single breath. The engineers, the security guards, the cooks, erased by a single volley from an unknown enemy." Cooper hauled himself to his feet. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the shoulder dislocated. He ignored the blinding pain. He looked at the tactical display. The alien fleet hadn't moved. They were simply hanging there, suspended in the dark, watching the outpost bleed out. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. "They're the Vord," Jenkins whispered, her face pale as a sheet. She stared at the sensor telemetry. "The kinetic profile matches the redacted files from the Perseus skirmishes. It's the Vord." The Vord, an expansionist empire 3 sectors over. Humanity had known about them for a decade, but had never engaged in open hostilities. The diplomats swore they were isolationists. The diplomats were fools. "They're painting us again," Hobbs shouted, his hands frantically rerouting whatever pitiful power remained to the forward deflectors. "Main battery is charging. Major, we can't take another hit." Cooper looked out the window at the jagged, silent fleet. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a raid for resources. You don't bring 30 dreadnoughts to steal a few canisters of helium-3. This was a statement. This was a boot coming down on an anthill, just to see what the ants would do. "No," Cooper said softly. The cynicism was completely gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. "We aren't going to take another hit." The deck plating vibrated violently beneath Cooper's boots. The hum of the fusion reactor deep within the bowels of the outpost had turned into a frantic, high-pitched scream. It was running hot desperately, trying to feed power to shield emitters that were already slagged. Hull integrity at 14%. Hobbs reported, his voice tight. He wasn't looking at Cooper. He was staring at the telemetry, watching his own death approach in real time. They're taking their time, recharging the main spinal mount on their lead dreadnought. They want to make sure there's nothing left bigger than a toaster. Let them take their time, Cooper rasped, gripping the edge of the comms console with his good hand. Jenkins, cancel the distress signal. Sarah Jenkins snapped her head up, her eyes wide, terrified and confused. Sir, if we drop, the SOS command won't know we're under attack. The closest fleet patrol is 3 hours away, but we have about 40 seconds to live, Sarah, Cooper said, his voice dropping into a calm, steady cadence. It was the voice of a man who had accepted his fate and was now purely focused on his final task. They know that. We know that. A distress signal is a plea for help. We don't need help anymore. Jenkins swallowed hard, a single tear, cutting a clean track through the soot on her cheek. Then what do we send? Everything, Cooper said. He pointed his good hand at the tactical display. I want a full uncompressed telemetry burst. I want their shield frequencies, their engine heat signatures, the precise dimensions of their hulls. I want the trajectory they took to jump in, and I want the exact wavelength of the weapon that just killed our people. You package all of it. Hobbs looked back over his shoulder. He wiped the blood from his eyes, leaving a crimson smear across his brow. A targeting packet. You want to send command a targeting packet? I want to send them the rope these bastards are going to hang themselves with, Cooper growled. The station rocked violently. Another structural support gave way deep in the lower decks. Sparks cascaded from the ceiling like malicious rain. The lights flickered, died, and then the emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the command deck in a harsh, rhythmic red. They're powering up, Hobbs shouted. 20 seconds until they fire. Jenkins encrypted. Archangel clearance. Cooper ordered. Route it through the hypercom buoy. Don't wait for a handshake protocol from command. Just punch it through the blind. Jenkins's fingers flew. The fear in her eyes was still there, but it was buried under the intense, frantic focus of her training. She wasn't just a kid anymore. She was a soldier of the Earth Systems Alliance, and she had a job to do. Compiling sensor data, compressing. I'm tying it to the reactor's main line. It's going to drain whatever we have left in the shields, Major. Do it. The lights on the console flashed green. Package is ready, Jenkins said, her voice shaking only slightly. Awaiting your code, sir. Cooper leaned over the console. He looked at Jenkins. He looked at Hobbs. Two people he had spent the last year mildly annoyed by. Two people who were about to die in the dark with him. It's been an honor, gentlemen, Cooper said quietly. See you in hell, boss, Hobbs replied, offering a grim, blood-stained smile. Cooper punched his command code into the physical keypad. M44 Alpha Actual. Transmit, Cooper ordered. Jenkins slammed her hand down on the activation stud. Beneath them, the fusion reactor practically detonated with effort. The remaining shield power was entirely shunted to the hypercom array mounted on the station's highest spire. A concentrated, tightly beamed pulse of raw data shot out into the void, piercing the veil of hyperspace, moving infinitely faster than light. It was a dense, heavy file. It contained the dying screams of Jericho 7 mathematically quantified into tactical advantage. Out in the void, the Vord commander watched the pathetic human outpost drop its shields. He likely assumed it was a surrender, a mechanical failure. the inevitable result of inferior engineering. He didn't order his weapons officer to halt. The Vord didn't care about surrender. They cared about clearing the rock. The Lee dreadnought fired. The violet beam, thick as a skyscraper, struck Jericho 7 dead center. The titanium blister didn't stand a chance. The reinforced bulkheads vaporized instantly. The air inside the command deck flashed to plasma. Major Thomas Cooper didn't feel the heat. He didn't hear the roar. 1 second he was looking at the jagged black ships in the sky, and the next he was simply gone, reduced to subatomic ash, alongside Jenkins Hobbs and 39 other souls. Jericho 7 shattered into 1,000,000 burning fragments, scattering across the barren gray surface of the moon like glowing embers. The Vord fleet held their position for a few moments, scanning the debris to ensure absolute destruction. Satisfied, their massive engines flared, and they slowly began to turn their prows toward the inner systems. They had kicked the anthill. They were ready to march on the colony worlds. They didn't know that the anthill was already gone. They didn't know they had just kicked a landmine. Geneva Command was not a place of action. It was a place of sterile, cold calculation. Buried 2 miles beneath the Alps, surrounded by 10 meters of reinforced plasteel and electromagnetic shielding, it was the nervous system of the Earth Systems Alliance. It was quiet. It was clinically clean. Admiral Richard Hayes stood at the center of the strategic holo map, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes the color of old ice and a demeanor to match. He was currently listening to a logistics report regarding grain shipments to the Alpha Centauri colonies. It was mundane. It was necessary. Then the holo map went dark. The hum of the subterranean command center vanished, replaced by an absolute terrifying silence. Every technician, every strategic officer, every communications specialist froze. A single pulsing red icon appeared in the center of the massive holographic display. It wasn't an SOS. It wasn't a distress call. It was a Priority 1 Archangel alert. "Report," Hayes snapped his voice, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Captain Wyatt, the duty officer, scrambled at his terminal, his face drained of color as the decrypted data poured across his screen. "Admiral, it's a blind burst from Jericho 7, Orion Spur Outpost. It's an Archangel packet." Hayes felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. Archangel wasn't a call for reinforcements. Archangel meant the sender was already dead, and they were sending the autopsy report. "Put it on the primary," Hayes ordered. The holomap flared to life. It didn't show a battle. It showed a frozen moment in time, the telemetry of 30 Vord dreadnoughts perfectly rendered down to the millimeter. It showed their weapon signatures. It showed their shield harmonics. And at the bottom of the screen, a simple line of text blinked in stark white Jericho. 7 lost. All hands killed. No survivors. Tactical data attached. Hayes stared at the projection. He looked at the jagged alien ships. The Alliance had kept their distance from the Vord. The politicians had preached patience, understanding, and diplomatic outreach. The politicians believed that humanity was past its brutal, violent history. Hayes knew better. Humanity had simply put its brutality in a very secure box, waiting for a rainy day. Jericho 7 was a small rock, 42 people. In the grand scheme of a galactic civilization numbering in the tens of billions, it was a statistical rounding error. But humanity didn't do math when it came to its own blood. Do we have a confirmation on the attackers? Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. Confirmed Vord Dreadnought class. Wyatt said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Energy signatures match their military caste. Admiral, they fired unprovoked. No comms chatter, no demands. They just wiped the station. They think we're soft, Hayes muttered almost to himself. They saw a civilian mining rig and thought it was the extent of our military capability. He turned away from the holomap. He walked slowly to a heavy biometric vault set into the far wall of the command center. Captain Wyatt, initiate the dead hand protocol. The command center, already quiet, somehow became even stiller. The technician stopped breathing. Admiral, Wyatt hesitated, his voice trembling. Protocol 7. We need congressional approval for a Congress is asleep, Captain, Hayes said, coldly, placing his right hand flat against the biometric scanner of the vault. The Vord are not. By the time the politicians wake up, form a committee and debate the ethical implications of this unprovoked slaughter. The Vord will be glassing the outer colonies. We built the system for a reason. Initiate the protocol. Wyatt swallowed hard, turned his key, and typed in his authorization. Protocol 7 active, awaiting secondary confirmation. The vault clicked open. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a single archaic brass key. Hayes picked it up. It felt heavy. It felt like consequence. He walked over to a standalone console in the corner of the room. It wasn't connected to the main network. It was hardwired directly through the bedrock to a deep space platform orbiting Neptune. Captain, do we have the coordinates of the Vord Homeworld? Yes, Admiral, Wyatt said. Naval intelligence mapped it 6 years ago during the Perseus mapping initiative. Vord Prime, highly populated, core world. Feed the coordinates to the platform, Hayes ordered. He inserted the brass key into the console. He didn't turn it yet. He looked back at the holomap. He looked at the 42 names that were currently scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Thomas Cooper, Sarah Jenkins, David Hobbs, plumbers, engineers, security guards. The Vord believed in a hierarchy of strength. They believed that power was the only universal language. If you showed weakness, you were prey. They had kicked the door in expecting to find sheep. It was time to show them the wolf. Coordinates locked, Admiral, Wyatt said softly. The Vord have operated under the assumption that distance is safety. Hayes said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. They believe that because their homeworld is 2,000 light years away, they can strike our borders with impunity. They are relying on the traditional rules of warfare. Hayes gripped the brass key. Humanity, Hayes said, his eyes narrowing, no longer plays by traditional rules. He turned the key. 2 billion miles away, in the dark, freezing orbit of Neptune, a massive structure came to life. It wasn't a ship. It was a barrel. It was a linear accelerator, 20 miles long, built around a solid slug of depleted uranium and tungsten the size of a small skyscraper. It was the spear of God. It didn't rely on lasers or plasma. It relied on Isaac Newton. The launch sequence took exactly 40 seconds. Massive electromagnetic coils spun up, drawing power from 3 dedicated fusion reactors. The slug was magnetically suspended, locked in the center of the tube. And then the spatial fold generator directly in front of the barrel activated. It didn't just open a window into hyperspace. It tore a bleeding, gaping wound in reality itself, creating a tunnel that linked the dark space of Neptune directly to the gravity well of Vord Prime. The coils fired. The slug was accelerated to 99.9% the speed of light. It entered the spatial fold in less than a fraction of a millisecond. It had infinite mass. It had infinite energy. "Payload deployed," Wyatt whispered in the Geneva Command Center. "Estimated time to impact." He paused, looking at his screen, his brain struggling to comprehend the physics. 0. It's already there. Admiral Hayes didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just stared at the blank holo map. "May God have mercy on them," Hayes said quietly. "Because we just ran out." Physics is a stubborn, unforgiving master. It does not care about diplomacy, morality, or the screams of the dying. It only cares about mass and velocity. When a projectile travels at 99.9%, the speed of light, it fundamentally alters the rules of engagement. There is no early warning system. There is no klaxon, no frantic shouting on a command deck, no desperate scrambling of interceptors. The light carrying the visual evidence of the weapon's approach arrives at the exact same moment the weapon itself strikes. You do not see it coming. You simply cease to be. Vord Prime was a jewel of an empire. It was a world of towering obsidian spires, sprawling megacities that crawled across the continents, and orbital rings humming with the traffic of a civilization that had conquered its corner of the galaxy. It was home to 14 billion souls. It was the heavily fortified, impregnable heart of the Vord war machine. The Spear of God hit the upper atmosphere above their capital city at an angle of 90 degrees. The air didn't have time to part. The oxygen and nitrogen molecules couldn't move out of the way of the tungsten-uranium slug. Instead, they were violently compressed against the nose of the projectile, their atomic bonds shattering under the sheer kinetic force. They underwent instantaneous nuclear fusion. A fraction of a millisecond before the slug actually touched the ground, a column of blinding white plasma, hotter than the core of a blue supergiant, drilled through the sky. When the slug struck the crust, it didn't just crack the tectonic plates, it liquefied them. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to 1 billion megatons of TNT. The crust of Vord Prime rippled outward from the impact zone like water disturbed by a thrown stone. Mountain ranges were flattened into dust in seconds. The oceans didn't just boil, they instantly sublimated into superheated steam, adding to a global shockwave that tore across the planet's surface at hypersonic speeds. The atmosphere ignited. A wave of fire scoured the globe, stripping away cities' forests and every living organism down to the bedrock. Back in Geneva, 2,000 light-years away, the command center was dead silent. Admiral Richard Hayes watched the telemetry feed relayed by a deep space stealth drone orbiting the Vord system. The holomap displayed the planet in stark clinical wireframe graphics. A moment ago, the sphere had been a vibrant blue and green, pulsing with trillions of data points, communication webs, and energy grids. Now the sphere was a violent, angry red. The data points were gone. The communication webs were silent. The planet's core was exposed, a jagged, bleeding wound in the cosmos. "Impact confirmed," Captain Wyatt said. His voice was completely hollow. He wasn't a soldier reporting a victory. He was a mortician recording a time of death. "Planetary crust has suffered catastrophic failure. Atmospheric ignition complete. Massive seismic destabilization." Wyatt paused, his eyes locked on his screen. His hands hovered over the keyboard, shaking slightly. "Admiral, the planet is breaking apart. The mantle is expanding. It's a total extinction event. 14 billion. Hayes didn't blink. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, his posture perfectly rigid. He looked at the glowing embers of a world he had just erased with the turn of a brass key. "Update the threat assessment board, Captain." Hayes ordered, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Sir, the Vord Homeworld is no longer a strategic concern," Hayes said smoothly. "Mark it destroyed. Reallocate sensor bandwidth to track their remaining fleet assets." One of the junior technicians in the back row stood up, leaned over a trash can, and violently vomited. Nobody reprimanded him. Nobody even looked at him. The air in the bunker felt thick, suffocating. They had trained for war. They had simulated ship-to-ship combat, orbital bombardments, and ground invasions. They had not trained for the localized, instantaneous deletion of a species. Hayes finally turned away from the holo map. He looked at the pale, shell-shocked faces of his bridge crew. "Every one of you knew what Protocol 7 was when you took this post." Hayes said, his tone low, carrying the heavy, gravelly weight of absolute authority. "The Vord bypassed our military borders and slaughtered civilians. If we responded with a diplomatic protest, they would have seen it as weakness. If we responded by sending a fleet to fight their fleet, it would have validated their tactics. It would have told the rest of the galaxy that human lives are a commodity to be traded in a prolonged war of attrition." Hayes walked slowly down the center aisle of the command deck. "We do not trade," he said. "We do not fight wars of attrition. We draw a line in the dirt, and if you cross it, we burn your house down with everyone inside. That is how humanity survives the dark. Remember the 42 people on Jericho 7. Keep your eyes on your screens." Secretary of State Evelyn Reed did not look like a woman who commanded the diplomatic might of the Earth Systems Alliance. She wore a wrinkled gray suit thrown over a plain blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a haphazard clip, and her eyes were bloodshot from sleep deprivation. It was 3 a.m. in Geneva. She slammed the heavy plasteel door of the command bunker open, flanked by 2 bewildered Alliance Marines, who clearly hadn't known whether to stop her or salute her. She marched straight past the security checkpoint, her heels clicking aggressively against the grated floor, and stopped dead in front of the primary holo map. She stared at the spinning, fragmented, burning husk of Vord Prime. "Tell me this is a simulation, Richard," Reed said. Her voice was trembling, but not from fear. It was vibrating with a white-hot, entirely uncontained fury. Admiral Hayes stood on the elevated command dais, calmly reviewing a datapad. He looked down at her. "It's not a simulation, Evelyn. The threat has been neutralized." "Neutralized?" Reed shrieked, the diplomatic veneer completely cracking. She pointed a shaking finger at the red hologram. "You murdered an entire planet. You bypassed the civilian government. You ignored the oversight committees, and you committed the single largest act of genocide in recorded history. I followed Protocol 7. Hayes countered, calmly stepping down from the dais to meet her at eye level. "A protocol drafted, approved, and codified by your predecessors, Madam Secretary. An unprovoked strike on human civilians by a foreign state actor with no prior declaration of war. Protocol 7 was a deterrent," Reed argued, stepping into his space. She was a foot shorter than the Admiral, but she refused to yield an inch of ground. "It was a boogeyman. It was supposed to be a theoretical weapon to keep the peace. You don't actually pull the trigger. A deterrent that you are unwilling to use is just a bluff. Evelyn," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. And out here in the deep black, someone is always going to call your bluff. The Vord called it. There were children on that planet. Reed whispered, the anger suddenly giving way to a profound, crushing horror. Tears welled in her eyes. There were civilians, artists, workers who had nothing to do with their military. 14 billion lives, Richard. How do you wash that blood off your hands? I don't, Hayes replied, instantly. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no search for moral absolution, just the cold, brutal truth. I let it stain. I carry it so you don't have to. You want to keep your hands clean, Evelyn. You want to sit in your pristine offices in Paris and Geneva and negotiate trade routes and cultural exchanges. Fine. But you only get to do that because men like me are willing to do the monstrous, unforgivable things required to keep the monsters at bay. Reed stared at him. She looked at him as if he were an alien, something fundamentally inhuman wearing an admiral's uniform. You're insane. When the galactic community finds out what we did, when the rest of the Orion Spur sees this, they won't fear us, Richard. They will unite against us. We will be the pariahs of the universe. They will put us down like rabid dogs. No, they won't, Hayes said, turning his back on her and walking back up the steps to the command dais. Fear is the great equalizer, Evelyn. By tomorrow morning, every ambassador from here to the galactic core is going to know exactly what happens when you scratch human paint. They aren't going to unite against us. They are going to trip over themselves, trying to sign non-aggression pacts. He picked up his datapad. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Captain Wyatt. Hayes called out, his voice echoing across the silent bunker. Sir Wyatt responded, standing rigid at his station. What is the status of the Vord Armada that attacked Jericho 7? They are still holding position in the Orion Spur, Admiral, approximately 2 light hours from the debris field of our outpost. They haven't moved. Reed closed her eyes, rubbing her temples. They're waiting for our fleet. They're trying to draw us into a battle. Let them wait, Hayes said. He looked back at Reed. You want to salvage something from tonight, Madam Secretary? You want to do your job, draft a message to the rest of the galaxy. Tell them the truth. Tell them exactly what we did and why we did it. And tell them to stay out of our way. And the Vord fleet? Reed asked bitterly. There are 30 dreadnoughts out there heavily armed, and they are about to realize they have no home to return to. They have nothing left to lose. They are going to tear through our outer colonies. A thin, razor-sharp smile touched the corners of Hayes's mouth. It wasn't a happy expression. It was the look of a predator that had cornered its prey. They won't get the chance, Hayes said. They attacked a human outpost. I promised a response. The planetary strike was just the preamble. Deep in the inky void of the Orion Spur, the Vord Armada hung in perfect disciplined formation. 30 dreadnoughts, massive and jagged like shards of black glass, drifted silently against the backdrop of distant stars. Aboard the flagship fleet commander Valen, a high-ranking caste leader bred specifically for tactical supremacy, paced the command deck. His bridge was a masterpiece of Vord engineering. Dark utilitarian bathed in low-light ultraviolet displays. There were no chairs, no comfort. The Vord did not sit when they were at war. Valen watched the tactical plot. It had been nearly an hour since they had vaporized the pathetic human mining structure. He had ordered the fleet to hold their position. The doctrine was simple: strike a soft target, wait for the enemy's rapid response force to arrive in a panic, and annihilate them in an ambush. Break their spirit, then march on their colonies. But the humans were late. Status on the enemy's slipspace signatures. Valen demanded, his mandibles clicking in irritation. His sensory officer, a lower caste drone tethered directly into the ship's neural network, chattered a negative response. No slipspace ruptures detected, Commander. The sector is quiet. No human ships approaching. Valen stopped pacing. This was incorrect. The psychological profiles on humanity suggested a highly reactive, emotional species. They should have sent a vanguard by now. They should have charged headlong into his trap. Commander, the communications officer, spoke up, its voice tight with sudden confusion. I am losing the quantum entanglement link with Prime Command. Valen snapped his head toward the officer. Impossible. Quantum links do not degrade. Check the manifold alignment. The alignment is perfect, the officer replied, its multi-jointed fingers flying across the console. The signal is not degrading. It is gone. The node on Vord Prime is no longer responding. A cold, unfamiliar sensation crept up Valen's spine. The quantum tether was tied directly to the central command spire on their homeworld. The only way the signal could drop was if the spire was physically destroyed. Re-establish the link through the orbital relays. Valen ordered, his voice rising in volume. Orbital relays are unresponsive. Lunar relays are unresponsive. Secondary planetary defense grid, unresponsive. The officer turned to look at Valen, its dark segmented eyes wide with a very un-Vord-like emotion. Panic. Commander, there is nothing but static on all frequencies. Vord Prime is gone. The bridge fell into a suffocating silence. It was incomprehensible. A civilization that spanned millennia, a homeworld fortified with the greatest defensive technologies in the sector, erased in the span of an hour. It defied all logic. It broke the fundamental rules of the universe. Before Valen could process the absolute collapse of his reality, the tactical plot in front of him shrieked. Slipspace ruptures, the sensory officer screamed. Massive spatial distortions detected, grid coordinates 003 through 090. The human fleet, Valen hissed, his warrior instincts violently overriding his shock. They used a cloaking field. Bring the main batteries online. Shields to maximum. Commander, the sensory officer stammered, staring at the telemetry. It's not a vanguard. Space tore open. It didn't ripple gracefully. It was violently ripped apart as human slipspace drives punched through the dimensional barrier. It wasn't a rapid response force. It was the Earth Systems Alliance, 1st, 3rd, and 5th Fleets. 250 warships spilled out into normal space surrounding the Vord Armada in a flawless spherical net. There were nimble frigates, heavily armored cruisers, and at the center, 6 massive supercarriers, their hulls bristling with kinetic railguns and heavy plasma batteries. They didn't maneuver. They didn't attempt to hail. They simply locked their weapons onto the 30 jagged black ships. Aboard the lead human supercarrier, the ESA Retribution Commander, Gregory Hale, sat in his command chair. He was 35, sharp-eyed, and completely devoid of mercy. He had read the telemetry from Jericho 7. He had seen the names of the dead. Thomas Cooper had been his instructor at the academy. All vessels locked on targets, Commander, his tactical officer reported. Keep the jamming fields up, Hale ordered. I don't want to hear a single word from them. No demands, no pleas, no surrender. Back on the Vord flagship, Valen watched the human fleet power their weapons. His tactical displays were drowning in red warning runes. His fleet was outnumbered 8-1. Their homeworld was gone. Their supply lines were gone. Their leadership was gone. In the span of 60 minutes, the Vord Empire had been reduced to 30 ships floating in the middle of hostile territory. "Transmit the surrender codes," Valen ordered quietly, his mandibles drooping in absolute defeat. There was no glory in dying against overwhelming odds. The only logical path was survival. "They are jamming all frequencies, Commander," the comms officer reported frantically. "They aren't receiving. They aren't listening." Valen looked at the main view screen. He saw the cold gray hulls of the human warships. They had no aesthetic grace, no artistic design. They were brutal functional blocks of metal built for one singular purpose. He realized then the fatal error his species had made. The Vord waged war for territory, for pride, for resources. They treated combat as a game of strategy. Humanity didn't play games. They exterminated pests. "Open fire," Commander Hale ordered, from the bridge of the Retribution. 250 human warships unleashed hell simultaneously. The void of space was illuminated by a blinding chaotic storm of kinetic slugs, heavy missiles, and concentrated plasma beams. The Vord dreadnoughts, previously thought to be the apex predators of the sector, were caught in a crossfire that defied description. Their dark, light-absorbing shields flared violently under the sheer volume of incoming fire, holding for only a few precious seconds before overloading and collapsing. Without shields, the jagged black holes shattered under the kinetic impacts. Missiles drove deep into their armored bellies, detonating inside their engineering bays. Dreadnoughts cracked in half-venting atmosphere debris, and thousands of Vord crew members out into the freezing vacuum. Valen's flagship shook violently as a concentrated volley of railgun fire tore through its port side. The lights on the bridge died, replaced by the red glow of emergency alarms and the sparks of severed power conduits. "Hull breaches on decks 4 through 12. An officer screamed before a secondary explosion ripped through the command deck, silencing him forever. Valen stood firm, clutching the edge of the tactical table. He watched his invincible armada dissolve into burning shrapnel. The humans didn't break formation. They didn't attempt complex flanking maneuvers. They simply tightened the noose, pouring relentless, overwhelming firepower into the center of the sphere, until nothing was left but expanding clouds of plasma and pulverized metal. It took exactly 4 minutes. When the firing finally ceased, the space where 30 Vord dreadnoughts had hung was completely empty, save for a slowly expanding field of unrecognizable debris. Aboard the Retribution Commander, Hale watched the smoke clear from the sensors. "All enemy targets destroyed, Commander." The tactical officer reported, his voice crisp and professional. "Scan for escape pods," Hale ordered. "Scanning. 0 contacts, sir. None deployed." Hale nodded slowly. He looked out into the blackness past the floating graves of the Vord fleet toward the invisible ruins of Jericho 7. 42 human lives had been taken. 14 billion plus 60,000 fleet personnel had been collected in payment. "Set a course back to the rally point," Hale commanded, turning away from the view screen. "Tell command the sector is clear. The anthill has been secured." The grand assembly of the Orion Concordat was designed to make its occupants feel small. The architecture was an exercise in intimidation. Sweeping arcs of bioluminescent crystal stretched hundreds of feet into the air, culminating in a vaulted ceiling that projected the swirling, majestic dust clouds of the galactic core. It was a place where thousands of species came to debate, to trade, and to assert their dominance through endless, exhausting bureaucratic warfare. Usually, the chamber was a deafening cacophony of translated languages, clicking appendages, and synthesized booming voices. Today, it was absolutely horrifyingly silent. Ambassador Arthur Pendleton straightened his tie. He was 62 years old, suffered from chronic arthritis, and had spent the last 8 years being systematically ignored by every major political player in the Concordat. Humanity was considered a fringe species. They were loud, occasionally clever, but ultimately irrelevant. They controlled a meager patch of the outer rim and produced cheap fusion engines. They were not a military power. They were not a threat. Pendleton walked down the central aisle toward the primary podium. His footsteps echoed like gunshots in the vast, quiet chamber. Thousands of alien eyes tracked him. There were the towering, heavily armored reptilians of the Draxian hegemony. There were the slender aquatic diplomats of the Seedy Alliance. They didn't look at him with the usual cocktail of mild amusement and condescension. They looked at him as if he were carrying a highly unstable, explosive device. He reached the podium. He didn't look at the Prime Minister, a multi-limbed, deeply ancient creature that resided in a suspended tank of nutrient gel. Pendleton looked out at the assembly. He placed a small metallic data drive on the lectern. It clinked sharply against the glass. 24 hours ago. Pendleton began his voice perfectly level, broadcasted across the chamber in real-time translation. A heavily armed fleet of the Vord Empire crossed the boundary of sovereign human space. They approached an unarmed civilian mining platform. They did not issue demands. They did not attempt communication. They opened fire and murdered 42 of our citizens. A low murmur rippled through the hall, quickly stifled by the overwhelming tension. We do not possess a complex, multi-tiered justice system for unprovoked interstellar slaughter. Pendleton continued his gaze, sweeping across the Draxian delegation, who seemed to shrink back into their seats. We do not form subcommittees. We do not demand reparations or economic sanctions. Pendleton tapped the data drive. The vaulted ceiling above them shifted. The beautiful projection of the galactic core vanished. It was replaced by a sterile tactical feed. It was the footage from the stealth drone orbiting Vord Prime. The assembly collectively gasped. Some delegates turned their heads away. Some literally collapsed into their stabilization harnesses. They watched a world die in an instant. They watched a spear of light pierce the atmosphere and turn a 14 billion strong empire into a spinning ball of molten slag. They watched the laws of physics violently weaponized. The Vord are no longer a recognized political entity, Pendleton stated. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He sounded like a man reading a weather report. Their leadership is dead. Their homeworld is destroyed. Their vanguard fleet has been entirely eliminated by the Earth Systems Alliance Navy. The Prime Minister's voice crackled through the translation matrix, trembling with an emotion that transcended species barriers. Terror. Ambassador Pendleton, this is an atrocity. You have annihilated a pillar of the galactic community. You have destabilized the entire sector. What is your demand? Are you declaring a war of conquest? No, Pendleton said. We don't want your territory. We don't want your trade routes. We don't want a seat on your high council. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. The arthritis in his knuckles flared, but he ignored it. "We want you to look at that screen," Pendleton said softly, yet his voice carried into every corner of the massive hall. "And we want you to understand that humanity is perfectly content to be left alone. We will trade fairly. We will respect your borders. We will be the most polite, accommodating neighbors you have ever had. But if you touch our people, if you threaten our homes, we will not fight a war with you. We will simply erase you." He stepped back from the podium. He picked up his data drive and slid it into his coat pocket. "The Earth Systems Alliance officially closes its borders effective immediately," Pendleton announced. "Do not test us. You will not survive the results." He turned and walked back up the aisle. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. They simply parted like the sea, giving the frail old man a wide, terrified berth. They watched the human leave, knowing that the balance of power in the galaxy hadn't just shifted, it had been shattered. It was raining in Geneva. It was a cold, driving, miserable rain that soaked through heavy wool coats and chilled the bone. The memorial plaza outside the subterranean command bunker was entirely empty, save for 3 people and 42 black marble slabs. The slabs were perfectly uniform, arranged in a tight grid. No ranks were listed, no flowery epitaphs, just the names. Admiral Richard Hayes stood at the center of the grid. He wore his full dress uniform, the gold braid tarnished by the relentless downpour. He held no umbrella. He simply stood there, water running down his lined face, dripping from his jawline. Captain Wyatt stood 10 paces behind him, holding a black umbrella over his own head, looking miserable. "Admiral," Wyatt called out, his voice barely cutting through the sound of the rain hitting the marble. "You've been out here for 2 hours. Command is requesting your signature on the new perimeter deployment schedule." "They can wait," Captain, Hayes replied, without turning around. He was looking at a stone bearing the name Thomas Cooper. "The perimeter is secure. Nobody is coming within a light year of our borders." Footsteps splashed against the pavement. Secretary of State Evelyn Reed approached from the security checkpoint. She was flanked by her usual security detail, who wisely hung back. She held a clear synthetic umbrella, her gray suit swapped out for a heavy black trench coat. She walked up to stand beside Hayes. She looked at the names. "The media is calling you the Butcher of Vord Prime," Reed said quietly. Her voice was devoid of the fiery rage from the night of the strike. It was just tired. Incredibly, profoundly tired. "There are protests in every major city on Earth. The pacifist coalitions are demanding your court-martial. They say you committed a crime against the universe." "I did," Hayes said simply. "They are entirely correct to be horrified. If they weren't horrified, I would be worried about the state of our collective soul." Reed turned her head to look at him. "You don't care about the optics at all, do you, Richard? Optics don't keep the wolves from the door," Hayes said. He reached out his gloved hand, tracing the engraved letters of Sarah Jenkins's name. A 22-year-old kid who died, terrified in the dark. These people cared about optics. The politicians before us believed that if we just smiled wide enough and spoke softly enough, the predators of the galaxy would become herbivores. The Vord proved them wrong. 14 billion people, Richard, Reed whispered. I close my eyes and I can't even conceptualize the number. It's too big. It's too much blood. It is, Hayes agreed. And it's on my hands. I signed the order. I turned the key. Let the pacifists march. Let them scream my name in the streets. Let them burn me in effigy. They get to do that because they are safe. They get to hold on to their moral high ground because I paved it for them with the ashes of an empire. Reed looked away, staring into the gray, rain-swept sky. The political fallout had been catastrophic internally, but entirely non-existent externally. Pendleton's report from the Concordat confirmed it. The alien empires were not mobilizing against humanity. They were terrified, scrambling to dismantle their forward operating bases and pulling their fleets back to their core worlds. The human border was suddenly the safest place in the known universe. "What happens now?" Reed asked. "We've shown them the sword. They know we'll use it. But we can't keep living like this, Richard. We can't become the monsters in the dark. We are the monsters in the dark." "Evelyn," Hayes corrected her, turning to face her for the first time. His eyes were like chipped flint, cold, unbreakable. "We just happen to be the monsters that only eat other monsters. The galaxy will leave us alone. We will build our colonies. We will mine our asteroids. We will live our lives. And the spear of God will remain locked on the next closest hostile capital. It's a dark forest out there. We just proved we are the biggest, meanest thing lurking in the trees." He stepped away from the monument, walking past Reed. "Draft the deployment schedule, Captain Wyatt," Hayes called out as he headed toward the bunker entrance. "Send the 3rd Fleet to the Orion border. Make sure their transponders are on. I want everyone to see them." "Yes, Admiral," Wyatt said, falling into step behind him. Reed stood alone in the rain among the 42 black stones. She looked at Thomas Cooper's name. She realized with a sickening drop in her stomach that Hayes was right. The cost of survival was steep, and humanity had just paid it in full. 6 months later, the edge of the Orion Spur was a desolate stretch of space. It was a natural border, a vast expanse of hard vacuum, devoid of star systems or habitable planets. It had once been a highly contested smuggling route, crawling with pirates' Vord patrol ships and alien scavengers looking to pick off isolated freighters. Now it was a graveyard. It was silent. The ESA Retribution drifted slowly along the demarcation line. The massive supercarrier, flanked by a dozen heavy cruisers, painted an intimidating silhouette against the starfield. Its kinetic batteries were hot. Its shields were fully charged. Its crew was alert. Commander Gregory Hale sat in the center seat of the command bridge. He drank his coffee. It was real coffee flown in from a hydroponics facility on Mars. It tasted like actual dirt and caffeine, completely unlike the synthetic sludge the Outpost crews had to drink. He savored it. "Sensor sweep complete, Commander," the tactical officer reported from the pit below Hale's chair. "Sector 04 through 09 is clear. No slipspace signatures, no localized emissions. Acknowledge," Hale said, taking another sip. Status of the border beacons. "All automated warning beacons are broadcasting on a continuous loop, sir. Unencrypted, translating into 300 recognized dialects. The beacons were a recent addition. Every 1,000,000 kilometers along the human border, a heavily armored satellite sat in the void, broadcasting a single looping message. It didn't ask for identification. It didn't offer a greeting. It simply stated the coordinates of the border and warned that any unauthorized crossing would result in immediate lethal force. Nobody tested the beacons. "Commander," the communications officer spoke up, pressing a hand to his earpiece. "I'm picking up a faint distress signal. Narrow band. It's originating from just outside the border. Sector 02. Hale sat forward, setting his mug down. The boredom vanished instantly from his posture. Put it on the main display. Magnify. The primary holographic screen flickered to life. Against the deep black of space, a tiny battered vessel drifted aimlessly. It wasn't human. Its hull was an organic, spiraling design characteristic of the SETI Alliance. The ship was venting a thin trail of frozen atmosphere. Its main thruster was entirely slagged, sparking weakly in the dark. Identify, Hale ordered. It's a SETI civilian freighter. The tactical officer said, his fingers flying across his console. Looks like they suffered a catastrophic drive failure. They're dead in the water drifting toward our borderline. How close? They will cross the demarcation line in exactly 12 minutes, sir. Hale stared at the broken ship. 6 months ago, standard operating procedure would have been to deploy a rescue frigate tow the ship to a neutral port and engage in a lengthy diplomatic exchange of gratitude. But standard operating procedure died on Jericho 7. They are broadcasting an unencrypted audio transmission. Commander, the comms officer said, his voice hesitant. They are transmitting in broken standard English. Let's hear it, Hale commanded. Static hissed through the bridge speakers, followed by a frantic, high-pitched voice. It was desperate. It was dripping with unfiltered terror. Human warship. This is SETI vessel. Please, drive failure. We cannot stop. We cannot turn. Please do not fire. We are unarmed. We have children aboard. We cannot stop. Please, please do not erase us. The voice broke into a sob, followed by a chorus of panicked alien chattering in the background. They weren't asking for help. They weren't asking for a tow. They were begging for their lives, terrified that the mere act of drifting over an invisible line in space would trigger another planetary annihilation. The bridge of the Retribution went completely silent. The crew looked at their consoles. They looked at the screen. Nobody looked at Commander Hale. Hale felt a heavy, cold knot form in his stomach. He remembered the feeling of pride he had when they shattered the Vord Armada. He remembered the righteous fury of vengeance. But listening to the crying alien on the radio, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a monster. He felt like the thing that inhabited nightmares. Humanity had successfully communicated its message to the universe. They were no longer prey. They were the apex predator, and the universe was treating them exactly as such. Commander, the tactical officer asked quietly. Orders they cross the line in 10 minutes. Hale looked at the screen. He could order a strike. The rules of engagement permitted it. The politicians back on Earth would likely argue about it for months, but Admiral Hayes would back him. But Hayes had said they only ate other monsters. Drop our cloaking field, Hale ordered, his voice steady. Bring the Retribution out of the shadow. Let them see us. Dropping cloak, the tactical officer confirmed. In the void of space, the massive, brutal geometry of the human supercarrier shimmered into existence, eclipsing the stars. To the tiny alien freighter, it must have looked like the angel of death materializing from the ether. Open a channel, Hale said. Direct to their comm suite. The comms officer nodded. Channel open, sir. Hale leaned forward. He made his voice as calm, as measured, and as impossibly human as he could. SETI vessel, this is Commander Hale of the Earth Systems Alliance warship Retribution. We read your distress signal. You are in violation of our border space. A terrified wail erupted from the speaker, quickly cut off as Hale continued speaking. Cut your auxiliary power. Stand by for tractor beam lock. We are deploying a repair detail and medical personnel. We will fix your drive, and we will escort you back to neutral space." Hale paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Nobody is going to erase you today." There was a long, agonizing silence on the radio. Then a shaky, breathless voice replied, "Understood. Understood, human ship. We thank you. May the stars bless your mercy." "Close channel," Hale ordered. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his cold coffee. "Deploying tractor beam," the tactical officer said, a profound sense of relief bleeding into his professional tone. "Rescue teams are prepping in Hangar Bay 4. Hale looked out at the vast, uncaring expanse of the galaxy. Humanity had carved out its survival with extreme, unspeakable violence. They had drawn a line in the sand with the blood of an empire. But survival was only the first step. The real challenge was figuring out how to live with themselves afterward. They were the apex predators of the Orion Spur, the monsters in the dark. But maybe, just maybe, they could choose when to bare their teeth. The Retribution hauled the tiny freighter into its massive shadow, a giant carrying a wounded bird. The void remained silent. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy held its breath. The anthill was secure, and the wolves were keeping the watch. If you felt the adrenaline spike and the sheer unstoppable force of humanity's wrath in this story, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to show your support for HFY Sci-Fi. Share this video with anyone who loves gritty, grounded tales where humanity proves we aren't the prey, we're the apex predators. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Stay safe out there in the void.